is that your life's work, aside from your family, is common purpose, right? And it is, you founded it in 1989, and it is many things, but it is a formal program, right, that runs community-based leadership development programs, starting in the UK and then emerging around the world, right, and expanding kind of organically. But it's also very purposeful, right? Like it has intentionality and it has outcomes. And one of the things I was thinking about women emerging from isolation is it is intentional, but unlike common purpose, it has no program, there's no financial transaction, there's no set of outcomes, right? And one of the things that's sort of beautiful about it, as we were just talking about the internet, is it's one of those things that's one of the wonderful manifestations of the internet, because it takes advantage of all the things that are the best about it, the global, the free, the accessible. And so I wanted to just start by asking you why about women emerging. So, and my first part of that question is, when the lockdown, I believe that women emerged out of the pandemic, correct?
It did indeed.
So my first question is, we all experienced some degree of lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic, whatever that degree was. We experienced isolation. And just if you could share what your experience was as a person that travels a lot, is out connecting with people all the time, kind of your personal isolation experience at the beginning, what it felt like and what it was.
I had a particularly weird one because, as you quite rightly said, as my father would have described me, as the flying dead. I was flying all over the place, landing, moving, picking up things, picking up ideas, doing things. And then I arrived on the last flight out of Boston. I got out of Heathrow, met my husband, who said his mother was very close to dying and lockdown was about to happen. And so we got in the car and we drove as fast as we could, slept in the car in the icy cold, because it was February, if I'm right, and got to a Calmac ferry in Oban and got on a ferry and went for 2.5. It was the last ferry that we could have got on, and it was pretty empty, and we went over to an island that's off the west coast of Scotland called Colonsay, where my mother-in-law lives, where there are doctors but no medical really equipment. And we then, my husband and I, looked after my mother-in-law as she actually then took 3 months to die. I sort of discovered my mother-in-law. You know, she was a woman who had made our marriage pretty tough for the first 10 years because she adored my husband and didn't really want the interference. And she was a very, very difficult woman, born of a very different generation, an incredibly different class from me. And so we'd had a really tough relationship for years, and then we became very close during those 3 months. The lockdown was completely unreal. You were with a dying woman and a husband and medical people helping us, but we were largely making the decisions about how much morphine to give her every day. And during that period, I suppose I was just reminded of the power and the extraordinariness of women, reminded that, you know, things change. You know, she made my life pretty miserable for 10 years, and there was she, and I was there when she died. And she was a remarkable person with a remarkable story. And it slowly sort of unraveled with me. And I was it was completely overwhelmed by the power of women in an extraordinary, intimate, one-to-one situation, because she was in a lot of pain and it took a long time. And women emerging from isolation pretty well came out of that. When I started Common Purpose, and that was about getting all people together.
Yeah.
you know, when people have said, why aren't you doing work for women? Why aren't you running leadership programs just for women? I would say that's not what Common Purpose is about. I'm passionate about that. But that's not what Common Purpose is about. And I'm the chief executive. I'm the founder and the chief executive of Common Purpose. But having handed over to the amazing Adirupa Sengupta, who was my successor at Common Purpose, and having the sort of freedom of being the founder of Common Purpose and to think again, I sort of went back to the issue of women. And I'm hearing everybody saying that, you know, this was an enormous shock to the world and that everything would change after COVID. And the truth is that the cynic or the older person in me knows perfectly well that everybody always talks about change, but it never really happens, even with a shock COVID. And that those old adages are entirely right. If you get the same people and don't expect any change, there was a real truth that if we were going to learn anything out of COVID and learn anything about humanity through COVID, we needed some new players coming in, and that seemed obviously to be women, because we come with a fresh eye. So when we emerged from isolation, we had a job to do to make sure that things do change, but the isolation of COVID became a metaphor for thousands of years of being isolated. And so there was something really important that women had to, have to, will, need to do if things get different. And, you know, as we come out of COVID, we've got a fixed deadline we're all facing. You know, in 30 years' time, we all fry. So we've got, you know, the pressure to change is extraordinary. Yeah. But let's face it, the pressures to go back into the old ways are also extraordinary. So I think women emerging, and women must emerge from isolation. But to be heard, there's going to have to be a combined voice.
First of all, I'm surprised. It's not what I expected at all. So that's always interesting, that story. I expected, well, I traveled a little less and blah, blah, blah. But it was it was a really profound shift to the most basic experience of caregiving, right? And that so fascinating. But with regard to women emerging, did you have in your mind a goal for it when it started? Or was it an impulse, an activity? Was there a goal? Was there like, we're going to do this or not?
When I was first pregnant, I remember someone gave me a book, and in this book it had sort of 40 spreads. So it had a spread for each week of maternity, yeah. And the first thing that was a shock to me is I always thought that it took 9 months, and I suddenly realized it was 9 months. I suddenly realized it was 10 months. That was a bit of a shocker. But the second thing is that I realized there was a whole group of extraordinary women who read the whole book.
Right.
And then there are some women like me who read just the spread that they're in. Right. And that if you read too far ahead, you might not even get pregnant at all. And certainly if you read the stuff after the 40 weeks, you absolutely guaranteed would not do it, right? So the truth is that I try very hard to go on instinct, and that has over the years served me very well. And instinct, let's face it, is usually based on experience and then an ability to trust that instinct. So there was a certain amount of trusting in it. The second is an entirely selfish thing, is that I was thinking, how can I serve the interests of women the best? You know, that was my biggest objective. You know, how can I use the fact that because of Common Purpose, I know an awful lot of people, and particularly an awful lot of women, and particularly a lot of powerful women, that I've never thrown my weight around, so people probably wouldn't assume that this was all about me. There was an important thing to be done here, and that, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about leadership. I've written a couple of books on the subject. I know a reasonable amount about leadership. So how could I add value? Because to me, it's undeniable if you have if you have a more combined and a stronger voice for women in the world, that's got to be good.
Yeah.
Now, how can I help that happen? And it's, so that's what I came to. And then, to be honest, I sort of looked at the scene and I saw all this, everything that was going on around there, around women. And if I'm really honest, I was a bit sad that I'd been diverted for 30 years of running Common Purpose, and not a hell of a lot of progress had been made in that 30 years. And, well, you know, you could say there's some progress, but the truth is that if you remember what computers were like 30 years ago and how much that's changed in 30 years, if you track the rapid progress on almost all fronts in the world, it is an extraordinary speed of progress. The one thing that hasn't changed much, frankly, and certainly not at the speed of the rest, is the progress of women in the world. So I accept that there's some progress, but I cannot say it's at the speed that everything else has been changing. But I looked at it hard, and I thought there were two things I could add value on. One was that, you know, this illusion that women don't work together was still around, and it's my observation is ridiculous, and women work extraordinarily well together, but could be even better at it if more women understood what it's like to be a woman in a culture that's not their own. So, having written this book called Cultural Intelligence, it was obvious to me that there was a possibility of trying to increase the ability of women to work together by increasing their cultural intelligence. Yeah. And that's something I thought, right, I can do that. That's something I can add real value to. And that's why those films that come out every Wednesday happen, to get women to see the world through another woman's eyes. But the second one is, you know, we have all these programs to empower women. I mean, masses, an abundance of programs to empower women. And then you get those women on a leadership program, and the reading list is largely written by men. You know, almost all the leadership books are written by men.
Yes.
And there are definitely a lot of leadership books written by women, but the vast majority of them are about how to succeed in a man's world, which has never been in any great interest to me. So it seems to me that if we could try and capture, by engaging many, many women from across the world, and not just women from the Western world lecturing everybody else on what it is to be a woman, but if you could get women right across the world working together to try and redefine leadership in a way that is attractive to women, so that young women say, if that's leadership, then yeah, of course I'll do it. And so that more established leaders will say, you mean I don't have to do it the man's way? And by the way, I have to do it the man's way and then be authentic about it, which is particularly ridiculous.
Yeah.
If I don't have to do it the man's way, that's really interesting. Tell me more. So I think if we can do a little reframing of leadership as something that resonates for women, and it has to be said, in my experience, an enormous number of men who also don't quite fancy the current model.
How did you actually decide who to interview and in what order? How did you go about it? You've interviewed, I don't know, is it 52, 60? How many women is it now? 60 interviews on YouTube. There's at least 52. I don't know. There's a lot.
There's a lot of them.
You got to spend time with a lot of women who you may have spent a little time with, but really got to go deep. What themes emerged? What kind of bubbled up in the body of, in the kind of series that emerged for you that maybe you hadn't expected?
Maybe I had expected it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe I had expected it, the sort of reminder of how lucky I am that I had parents who never fed me all that rubbish about being they gave me all the confidence that I needed and never gave me any imposter syndrome, I don't think. And it's a reminder of how lucky I am and how unfortunate most people are, that the imposter syndrome and the lack of confidence and the servile attitudes, all of those in different cultures, they're so deeply embedded, and it will change only incredibly slowly. First point. So that was more of a reminder than a surprise.
Yeah.
And then the reminder of just how unbelievably grim many women's lives are, and they're particularly grim when they're brave and they stand up. And think of all those Afghan judges in Afghanistan, who've stood up and been counted, and now look where they are. So the unbelievably tough lives that many women lead, I think I was surprised and maybe slightly ashamed that I was a white Western woman who, by definition, I must play my part in. I hope I don't play too big a part in it, of trying to consciously or unconsciously kidding ourselves that we've made enormous progress, and if everybody else just followed us, everything would be marvelous, which is so far from the truth. It's neither marvelous in the Western world, and nor is, to be a woman, you can be all kinds. I've just been interviewing a young woman violinist, and she was saying, I was brought up to be tough and independent, and that's part of the trap of feminism, because it wouldn't allow me to be soft and kind as well. And it's taken me a long time to stop being tough and independent and regard anything that's soft and gentle as weak. There's all kinds of introverted things, but I think that there is what I would call a sort of feminist imperialism out there, and by definition, I must be part of it.
Yes.
Last week, did a most wonderful exchange between a very famous actress in India who amongst all her extraordinary achievements, she's also somebody who's really spoken very openly and clearly about skin color in India and all the creams, etc., to make you more white, and a woman called Lola Young in the UK, who's a very strident and powerful and absolutely wonderful footballer, who's a woman of color in the UK, and they're talking about color of skin. And I know quite a few of the things that they're talking about, but lots of the things I hadn't really understood. And listening to them, you sort of, to be honest, all the way through, you go, okay, got it. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. I should, that was, all the way through, you're seeing things through other people's eyes. So it's a surprise to me that that not more of that has happened. And then I suppose the last thing that's been a surprise to me is all the sort of lovely pep talks. There's an enormous amount of stuff for women that's about, you can be an astronaut, you can be anything you want, here are the 10 things that you need to do. And they're all very positive. And the truth is, it doesn't actually prepare you for the fact that the world stinks out there very often. And if I'm honest too, my 3 middle children are daughters, and they've all been going through their sort of early careers. And I don't think I prepared them at all well. for the misogyny that they've experienced. It's been a real surprise to them. None of them would have described themselves as feminists when they were 19, because they didn't see any need for it, because in our household probably there wasn't any need for it.
Yeah.
But I think they would all describe themselves as aggressive feminists now, because they've just seen what the world's like. And I think maybe, you know, all this positivism, I don't want to knock the positivism, but we need to have an element of realism in it too, what you're up against.
Yeah, God, you're uncovering so many good things. One is this sort of, there's a whole discussion to be had on the kind of history of feminism, right? Which, you know, wow. So was a led by white women. You know, when I was coming up, the books I read were Virginia Woolf and Betty Friedan, right? And then the national in the U.S. and then international moment of racial reckoning of last summer, and this increasing acknowledgement of the intersectionality, right? And there's so much richness there. I think one thing I've learned, and then I'll switch to a question, is one thing that I've learned this last year in terms of race and identity broadly is, if it feels uncomfortable, it's probably good. Because if it feels really comfortable and good, and you're fine with it, and you're dealing with someone who's objectively different than you, then you're not really dealing with it, unless they're your best friend, and then you transcend it, right? And I felt a kind of urgency for more, and I might get in trouble for this, but for more young women in the US and the UK and Europe, in places of relative privilege in terms of gender equity, to actually experience these stories and actually connect with their peers, colleagues, and women whose lived experience is different in terms of the environment in which they're growing up. And wondering if you've thought about that, and how do we make those connections for women here being in the UK or the US, and particularly young women? How do we bring these stories and this information into their world?
I think I'd slightly push back on the premise of the question. Okay. Because I do think we can kid ourselves about how much progress is being made.
Okay.
In the US and the UK. I mean, you know, when your presidential candidate got off that bus and said those things about women,
yeah,
I, like probably many women all over the world, thought, well, that's the end of his candidature. But it seemed to do the opposite.
Yeah.
And you know, I interviewed a young woman called Maria in Denmark, and you know, when I've been talking to people over the last year, very often people say, oh, well, things are much better in Scandinavia and in Denmark.
Yeah.
So I got Maria, who's, I don't know, 31, 32. And, you know, she starts the film by saying, I honestly don't recognize the progress that you theoretically are describing to.
Yeah.
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 And as she says, you know, we have the laws, but they are way ahead of the culture.
Okay.
And you know, one of my daughters was asked to sign a piece of paper the other day saying that when she went on maternity, she would only take 3 months worth of leave. And, you know,
she just started the job, like, not that she was pregnant, but just starting the job.
She is pregnant, so she has started the job.
Okay.
And you sort of think, well, one, that's an extraordinary thing to do, and it's an extraordinarily stupid thing to do legally in. But you know, we have made a lot of progress in Europe and in the US, but we've not made as much as we think of ourselves. And one of the things that's really interesting is to take women from the US to actually to talk to women from some African countries that have been matriarchal for centuries.
Right.
And, you know, American women are gobsmacked by it.
Right.
Because they're completely unaware of this fact.
Yeah.
So, to me, there is a lot more messiness. And a friend of mine who's on the board of an incredibly swanky American university said to me, you know, I saw some of the South Asian films and they were fascinating, Julia, but they really don't speak to my experience. And I said to her, but if that's true, why are you so quiet at the board meetings? And she went very quiet and she said, well, that's a good question, Julia. And it is a good question, because the same things that were plunged into a woman in South Asia's minds are still plunged into American women's minds.
Okay.
And they're still dealing with them. You know, they may look different, they may feel different, the laws may be different, the intensity may be different, the age at which it hits you may be different. But I do think that it's really important that women recognize that we are all on a journey at different places. Okay. And that nobody has got there, even remotely. And that the people who think that they're further ahead may not be quite as far ahead as they seem to kid themselves they are. And by the way, things can go backwards.
For me, if I acknowledge my own kind of relative power, which is different than what I experience in the morning of how powerful I feel and what I think I can accomplish, like there's a gap between that, but that is part of being a person and a woman, is the sense of, oh, what can I do to help? How can I help make it better? And in that notion of wanting to make it better for other people, there's also a sense of sort of, in a good way, owning power of like, I have some power to help, but then how does one navigate? And I think you talked about this a bit when you were, how does one navigate this space where you think you can help others because you're in a better off position, which has embedded in it a sense that I have a bit more power. And so there's an interesting sort of notion of power dynamic. And how does one unpack that? And I feel like you've thought about this and you've actually done it. And my question isn't particularly clear because I'm still grasping for this notion of power, and
we're all saying, what can we do to help?
Yeah.
It seems to me that we all have power.
Yeah.
You know, our power comes in different forms. Some is formal power, some is informal power. Some of them, it does come in very different forms.
Yeah.
So how do I add my energy to all of this? And, you know, years of talking to sisters sort of saying, well, you know, I couldn't possibly do that, or should I do this, or how do I do that? And to me, I always sort of parallel it to my head. It's sort of people who sort of stand on the side of a swimming pool saying, what's it like in there? And the answer, you know, get in the water, jump.
Yeah.
And when you jump in, then things will begin to happen and you'll begin to see things. And let's not take the analogy too far, but if you stay on the sidelines and say, how can I use my superior power? The first thing is to say, I haven't got superior power, I've just got some power and lots of other people have got other powers. So how do we combine our powers? First point. Yeah. Second point is jump in the pool, jump in the lake, jump in the water, jump in the puddle, whatever it is, get in there. And then things begin to emerge. And it's really important that they do. And then you say, you know, this isn't about me, this is about everybody. So therefore, where can I most usefully add my value? And, you know, there's a woman I have enormous respect for, who's really thinking through this issue of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
which interests me a lot. You know, if every time there's a challenge about the circular economy, it's men who win the prize, there's something wrong with that, because the circular economy is it circles quite a lot around women.
Yeah.
You know, you don't solve circular economy problems if you haven't got women at the table.
Right.
You know, one of my favorite of the films, you know, why do women carry all the weight of the water in the world in the villages? And then it's the men who decide where the pipes go. That's crazy. They'll go in the wrong place because the people who actually carry it aren't at the table.
Right.
If we're going to design digital payments, which are so important to the future of the world,
right,
it seems to be a group of men doing it. If we're going to figure out transport problems, it seems to be largely men around. So innovation seems to be overwhelmingly led by women. Even R&D is pretty heavily male. Now, that screams to me that's really suboptimal. If 50% of the population isn't there, and it's a particularly useful 50% of the population, both at coming up with the ideas and then implementing them. So, you know, so she's saying, I've always wanted to do something useful. And I said to her, well, this is absolutely up your street. And she said, yes, of course it is. This is what, you know, so you get in there and you find things that resonate with you. There is almost no important or unimportant table anywhere in the world that doesn't need a few more women at it.
Yeah. Have you thought about, as we get into this next phase of, it's not really post-pandemic, but you know, post-lockdown of pandemic and navigating the new kind of hybrid space? What's your thinking on the hybrid space and balancing the online versus the real life connection?
Women emerging from isolation is online, not because of COVID, but because it's by far the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Because you want to get women from around the world together. Sure, you can pay for a lot of flights, but it seems very expensive, both to the planet and the pocket. You know, I'd much preferred if LinkedIn was not so clunky and such an irritating platform, but it's the right one. You know, got to be pragmatic. But it'll be online for a very long time, because it's really, really important that somebody who's one of the leaders of the Maori nation in New Zealand hands on her knowledge and her questions and her insights and her beautiful wisdom to somebody who's in Chicago and frankly is dealing with some of the problems that Hinamo was dealing with a few years ago.
Yeah. So
I'm big online, and I think it gives women the edge. I cannot prove it. In my experience, women are much better at creating relationships on Zoom than men.
Yeah. Okay. So my last question is around the sort of what's next, and
I think 2022 is devoted to working with a group of women to produce a collection of work. Some of it might be books, some of it might be plays, some of it might be music. I've no idea what they'll be. That somehow frames leadership in a way that women say, yep, I'm a leader, or I will be a leader, and I'll be a different kind of leader. I would like to achieve that in 2022. And I think it's really, really important that it's a collection, because I'll see it from my eyes, and then other women will see it from other eyes, wherever they are in the world, or whatever sector they're in, or whatever generation they're in. You know, I spent my whole 20s rejecting leadership. My first language was French. There wasn't a word leadership in French. You know, I thought leadership was for men, and I thought leadership for women was for those sort of women who went to swanky schools that I didn't go to. And it took me a long time to realize that I could be the kind of leader that I wanted to be, not the kind of leader that I saw everybody else being.
Right.
And if I can, or we can, most importantly, help an enormous number of women to reduce, get to that point quicker than I did.
Yeah.
Because I spent most of my 20s destroying all the teams that I was part of, because it was irresistible undermining the leader. Till I suddenly realized that if I wanted to change the world, I'd have to be a leader, and I have to find a way of doing it so that it was the way I would do it.
Right.
So
right.
if one can reduce that and make it so that women discover what kind of leaders they can be, that they don't have to be like other people, they can be like themselves. And if it's a collection, it's beautiful because I can read the collection, I can take a bit from there, and Julia says something useful there, and then somebody else says something, and then you sort of put it all together. And I believe that how you lead is sort of almost to you, as unique to you as your DNA.
Yeah.
So you put all these bits together and you make your own DNA as a leader. And I'd love to find a DNA that makes sense to an awful lot of women,